Oh, you're a nice boy. The claws on you. Don't be annoying. Come here, mate. Let's have a look at you. Oh, you're a big boy. Wow. Mate, you'll be 30 years old, I reckon. Look at the claw on that. You do some damage to them, tiger. Alright, well, let's have a look at you. I might even get you weighed and measured. Do all that. Just hold your horses. Go there for a minute, matey.
Mate, when I've rung up the Federal Department of the Environment and explained the situation here at the point, including devils, lobsters, species of birds and mammals and whatever, they keep telling me that it's a state problem.
Yeah.
Well, who's ever responsible, it's a massive problem. It's got to be changed. It can't keep destroying the habitat, as you said. So under this RFA review, what do you hope would come out of it in terms of the lobster in particular?
This animal is a priority species under the RFA, and 20 years later, not 1 hectare has been specifically put aside as a reserve for some of their habitat. Now, there have been buffer zones put in on certain streams, so you've got a stream like this, which is probably a class 3, would have a 30 metre buffer. But if you go upstream, where all these streams start, then it's not considered suitable habitat, and so they don't put the bigger buffers on. Basically, you get these places cleared almost to the stream side. And this is a priority species. This is listed as a priority species under the RFA. So if it's a priority species, why haven't they made it a priority to look at some of the headwaters and some of the subcatchments and say, look, for this animal, we'll put aside some of these areas so we know they're always going to be in good condition. But they haven't done it. And 20 years later, we go to a meeting, and again, oh, we're going to think about this, we might do some more studies. Well, enough study. We know where they live, we know what they need. Put aside some small areas so they can live, I guess, unhindered forevermore. There's not that many areas left, believe it or not. There's only, certain subcatchments now that are considered good. So the reality is, as a species, as a priority species, it's Mickey Mouse. They've done nothing for them really as far as reserves. And 20 years later, I don't want to come back here and say, okay, we've run out of time, we've run out of land. The time is now to do something with this animal. Enough talk, enough politics, enough rhetoric. Okay, if it's a priority species, start making it a priority.
On an international basis, I know that scientists have come out from Germany and wherever else. What would they say if they were here now, having seen the impact of man on this localised environment in connection not only to the lobster but to the other threatened species, but mainly the lobster?
Look, if the lobster's protected, so every other species in this creek will be protected, which is blackfish, galaxids, all the bugs, the invertebrates, everything is protected. So this is called a flagship species, and it's quite common around the world that people, use a flagship species to look after everything else that lives in their environment. And that's fine because no one cares about, a certain slug that might be found halfway up a tree. But this is the largest freshwater invertebrate on the planet, and so people care. I guess if people from other countries come over and look at what's going on in Tassie, it's horrifying because there are no limits. It just seems to me like there's a game here where the industry says we're doing the right thing, but they're not. The government says we're doing this as a priority species, where we've got legislation in plans, blah, 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 but nothing happens.
It's all talk,
all talk, no action, and the bush is going backwards. And I don't think you have to be a rabid greenie to say, I want the bush looked after so these things survive and thrive in a habitat that is what they were living in 200 years ago. Now, this is progress, I know, but progress doesn't mean that you can stop looking after bits of bush. And at the moment, northwest Tassie is running out of good creeks and rivers. Most of them are sedimented already. And we are coming to an end game now where if we don't stop and say, look, we're going to look after this bit, and that bit, they're not going to be there 20, 30 years' time. And these blokes are going to have substandard habitat. They might not become extinct, but that's not the point. You don't want them to be on the brink. You want them to thrive. And for them to thrive, they need to have their habitat looked after. And we haven't done it, no matter what the state government says, no matter what the federal government says, no matter what the industry say, we haven't done the right thing by the habitat of these animals yet. And it's about time we pulled our finger out and did it.
Well, for people who are going to be seeing this filming, the surrounding district here, and we'll get general shots of it later, is going to be flat. Now, there will be buffer zones on the sides of the creek, but if you look up and around, you'll see where forestry impact has already been felt in terms of allowing a light in, which you might care to expand on in terms of the lobsters, the impact of light.
Look, if you've got trees, you've got shade. Shade will keep the temperature of this creek up to 5 degrees cooler in summer. Now on a hot day, even Tassie gets to say 25, 30 degrees. If these blokes sit in 23 degree water, they will eventually die. It's too hot. This creek should not go above 18, 19 degrees, even in summer, because of the shade. And you can see by the shade here on the creek itself, it's 95% covered by shade. It's actually quite cold here where we're filming. I mean, my knees are in the water, they're not hot. But for these blokes, that's perfect. They're not like the mainland where you can have 25, 28 degree water. These blokes are dead. We realise that we can't take the shade away from these streams. We're going to have more issues with this. We've already got creeks running into towns now that are too hot for these blokes to survive in. It's not good enough. It really has to change.
With forestry in Tasmania trying to get forestry stewardship certification, to me it's a joke. And to me and to many other people within Tasmania, unless Forestry Tas and the government start to do things in a proper manner, go back to no clear felling, selective logging, limited use of chemicals which would be disastrous for these things, then I just don't see a future in Tasmania for FSC. They don't deserve it, they shouldn't get it, and the Forest Stewardship Council to me have a responsibility to the whole community and not the industry. And we're finding out that government departments are too scared to talk to us because of the FSC hanging over the top. So I can just see that unless something happens quickly and effectively, Tasmania is just going to lose on the basis of the environment and everything we're talking about.
I guess the thing that people really need to understand about how a river system works is you've got the bush right here, you've got this fern coming right into the creek itself, and up in that bush you've got what's called leaf litter, which is basically a massive amount of leaves, twigs, ferns compacted onto the soil, so when it rains, this actually filters out all the dirt from hitting the creek. And that is really important for baby lobsters because this creek here has got rocks and gravel and larger rocks there that they can actually fit under. Now, a baby lobster is as big as your fingernail, so it's very, very tiny. And even a 5-year-old lobster will fit in the palm of your hand, so it takes a long time, and so they need these shallow areas with rocks to hide under for food, for shelter, and basically for survival. And so if you introduce sediment into the creek, you'll see over here everything's covered. Now a baby lobster has to hide somewhere. If it can't hide, it means it's exposed. If it's exposed to predators like platypus, blackfish, trout, galaxids, other lobsters, birds. If they're exposed, they're eaten. Also, if they can't get under these rocks because of the sediment, they lose their food supply, which are all the insects and the leaves that you'll find. This is lobster food here, bit of lobster food there, and you'll also find, if I lift up some of these rocks, there's a little mayfly here. That's lobster food. And so the whole food chain breaks down because of sediment. Now we've talked ad nauseum about the fishing being banned for these animals. A great thing, that stopped so many lobsters being taken. But the end game is the habitat. If you don't stop this sediment coming into the stream, the habitat's destroyed and your population will crash. Make no mistake, everywhere that I do surveys that's heavily sedimented, the population is probably less than 10% of that in the bush. It's as simple as that. If you haven't got these things filtering the water, if you haven't got these rocks for them to hide under, then you've got real trouble. The sediment will kill them. It's as simple as that. And to take away this bush, to take away the leaves, the twigs, the fern, the fronds that fall down and make a filter system will basically wipe out a population of lobsters. Like this here is a mayfly, which is baby lobster food. And in a good system, you will find hundreds of these animals. There's, in fact, two on this small rock here. There's two mayflies. You'll also find caddisflies, amphipods, worms, and these sustain young lobsters. Young lobsters tend to eat more high protein sources because they need to grow quickly to avoid being eaten. And so you need this animal source as well as the plant source, which is going to be these leaves that we're finding here everywhere. That's lobster food, and also there are animals living on these leaves in the water that are lobster food as well. So the whole system breaks down when you've got sediment introduced. I've just been up the stream, upstream up there, looking under rocks. The juveniles tend to prefer rocks that are probably the size of your fist, but generally a lot bigger, so you'd be looking at soccer ball, football size rocks, and that's where the babies will live. Now these babies will live in the shallows under these rocks for up to 5 years, possibly even longer, because it's the only place they're safe from bigger lobsters like the one down here, and from fish, from other predators such as platypus and birds. And so it's a pretty hard life being a baby lobster. It takes, from probably 2,000 lobsters, you might only get say 4 or 5 to adulthood. In the first year, half of them are eaten. And so if they haven't got those rocks to climb under and also feed under, because there's nothing worse than having to duck out of a rock to get a feed, if the food supply is there under the rock with it, then life's a lot safer. And so I've lifted up probably 100 rocks, and I've got a baby juvenile, and we can have a look at the size compared to this large adult. Now the juvenile's only 2 years old, and certainly might not survive the next 20 years anyway, but with any luck it will get to this size if it's one of the lucky ones. But I guess the point to make is that if the sediment comes into this stream and covers up those holes and becomes, I guess the rocks become embedded so they can't actually get under them, then you've got all sorts of troubles for the juveniles, and they will get eaten. I mean, life's hard enough. I think it's probably less than 1% survival estimated. If you take away the habitat that actually increases that survival, then you're basically looking at a 1 in a million chance of survival. So a juvenile lobster's got it hard enough without us introducing all that sediment, taking away the food supply and covering their homes. Okay, well obviously the first thing to look at with an animal this size, everybody wants to look at his claws. If you look at this side, this claw he probably lost in the first 2 years of his life, and it's grown back, mainly because it's skinnier and a bit slenderer along there. But if I turn him around, you'll see the muscle inside this claw fully formed, quite thicker, and the knobs inside the claw are also quite a bit bigger. So this is the original claw. This one he lost early in life, but he's lucky enough to lose it early. If he'd lost it later in life, you'd find it only be half the size. These claws are quite capable of breaking bone, so it's not a good idea to stick your hand or fingers in them. And if he gets hold of me, I'll know about it. But he can't actually feed with those claws. He can't actually get them into his mouth. He feeds by using the pincers on his 2 front legs, and they angle right into the mouth parts, which are here. Now these mouth parts actually force food down his throat, and they also have a chopping motion or a slicing motion. So he forces food down his throat with these nippers and also the mouth parts here. The antenna, he's got 2 large ones, basically feeling his way around. You don't want to bump into another lobster this size or bigger, because you might actually lose your claws or your legs or your life. The smaller ones are much more sensitive to taste and smell, and so he'll actually detect a lot of his food by using the antenna. The eyesight's not too bad. He's also got eye protectors right there so he can protect his eyes, because the life for a lobster is pretty rough. They spend most of their time living with other lobsters, and every now and again you have a bad day, then you have a fight. On a bad day, having a fight means you lose your life or 2 or 3 of your legs. So it's not an easy life being a lobster. Now it's a big boy. They do tend to have bigger claws, but also if you see where above my fingers you'll see sperm sacs, and he'll be mating around at March, April, depending on the season. It can vary a bit. The female will have 2 holes here where the eggs are extruded. The male actually releases sperm that actually dissolves in little canisters that actually dissolve in water. So when those canisters that are holding the sperm dissolve, the sperm comes out and fertilises the eggs. If it was a female, the eggs would be held under the tail here, and they'll be held for around 9 months. Hatch Christmas. The juveniles will stay there for 6 to 8 weeks and leave the mother around about mid-February. I guess the other thing to point out with these animals are the scars. Now it's pretty hard to pick up, but he's got a good scar there above my finger, and that basically is from the knobs inside another male's claws. So these knobs do tend to crush, and you've got a hole there that I can almost put my finger in, a hole there I can put my finger in, and a hole there. So he's been fighting a bit with other lobsters, and he's not that big. This bloke's probably three and a bit kilo. They get up to 6 kilos, so double the weight. So he won't get much longer, but his claws will get thicker set and heavier, and the body will get heavier. So like I said, he's only half the weight of the maximum size ever recorded, which means they're quite a big animal. He's quite hard to hold with one hand. If you look under the tail again, this is for balance. A female will hold the eggs on these pleropods, but also they're used for balance in the water, and you'll see when they're walking along, they move backwards and forwards. It's like your toes. If you don't have toes, you won't have balance. I guess the final thing that stands out are the flatworms on the inside of his claws here. They're a primitive worm that spend their whole life cycle on the lobster. So you can see they're crawling around here. In the water they've got 3 tentacles that will actually stick up, and they're filter feeders, and they feed on the algae that would grow in his shell and detritus. But the eggs of those animals are actually these little yellow cases here. So the whole life cycle is dependent on the lobster itself. Generally, if you have a creek that isn't in good condition, you'll find that the flatworms tend to drop off pretty quick, and the lobster has a clean shell of flatworms, and so it's a good indication of chemicals and pollutants in the water. So I'll pop him back because he's not happy. But that's the basics of a lobster, and especially a big male like this bloke here, who would have been 30 years old today. His birthday maybe.
So what length would the biggest lobster that you've caught be?
He'd be 70 centimetres stretched out. The biggest one probably 87 that I've caught. The biggest one's ever known. It's only estimates, 110. You're like, he's only half weight. That's in itself pretty hard to believe, isn't it? So yeah, they get bigger.
There's something prehistoric about them, isn't there? It's just the design is absolutely intriguing.
Well, they go back millions of years.
Sure do.
Around the Cretaceous period, we think. Righto, so this bloke here is 2 years old. This bloke here is 30 years old. And I guess the sizes speak for themselves. These blokes are really vulnerable for the first 5 to 10 years of their life. This fella here, well, not much is going to attack him, but unfortunately, only 1 in 1,000 will get to this size. If we introduce all that sediment, keep clearing the bush the way we are, the odds are going to stack further against these blokes surviving, and all of a sudden, we're going to have a lot less getting to this size. And you can see that it's quite a big gap. So, would he eat him? Yes, he would.
Todd, I don't know whether you know, but 58 hectares of this stuff and further to the south is going to be clear-felled by forestry Tas. And a very quick background to it is that all sorts of threatened species in here: lobster, Tasmanian devil. We've had Nick Mooney, the Tasmanian expert, up here, very concerned because there's so much habitat up here. How the Premier of this state can decide to make the Tasmanian devil an icon, I don't know, when he's allowing them to be murdered in the clear felling areas. It's simple as that. Why they don't trap for marsupials prior to logging, I don't know, and the complaints and whinges continue to go on and nothing is done about it. Now, Forestry Tasmania have made application on more than one occasion for forest stewardship certification. My humble opinion is, with the damage that's been done and is continuing to be done, as I've said previously on film, there is no way they should entertain Forestry Tasmania ever getting forest stewardship certification. Now, you know more than I do about the RFA stuff. If you could explain your opinion on this and what's coming out of the RFA review.
I just find it really difficult to grasp that you can become certified internationally with the practices that you are currently undertaking. I think you look at a clear-felled bush, a stream that's covered in sediment, a bush that's been clear-felled and then burnt, over the top of the streams. I think the arguing about whether these animals, these lobsters, live in the feeder streams, it's irrelevant. They flow downstream, so if you clear the top of those, it's going to affect the younger ones, when their own science says that a small increase in sedimentation levels will affect the baby lobsters. For the life of me, I can't understand how any international community would say, yes, we think you are doing the right thing and we'll give you this certificate of certification. It's just gobsmacking, because they're not doing the right thing. We have argued for 20 years about the buffer zones on river systems. We've argued for 20 years about getting some reserves put aside. And the science isn't there for them to say, no, we're doing the right thing. We are doing the right thing by buffers. We're not sure about what happens if all stuff flows downstream. We're not sure what happens when it rains. Well, hang on. You're trying to prove to the world that you are world's best practice? Then get the science behind it and show the world that you are looking after unique animals, because at the moment it doesn't stack up.
I'd have to say that FSC credibility is on the line.
Oh, I'd agree.
Their credibility, if they're allowing this to happen to threatened species in areas like this, not just the lobster but the whole list of them, FSC have a lot to be ashamed of already, and they need to change their way of looking at things if their credibility is to be considered on a worldwide basis, especially in Tasmania. That's how I am. I have tried to contact the head of FSC, won't ring back. He has been invited to this area, no response. So that's why I'm afraid I have to say the things that I'm saying now.
I think there's a process that they'll consider, but I think you've also got to look outside that process and go, okay, here are the facts, here are the pictures, here are the stories, and say, okay, are we doing the right thing in Tassie by our native animals? And look, when you see plans put out and they don't find for certain threatened species flora, they argue that because a lobster doesn't live in this small creek, it somehow isn't impacted if that creek is full of sediment. That doesn't stack up. If you've got Tasmanian devils here, there is no capture and release somewhere else. And I think to have experts come in and find that they haven't, or they've missed so much, it doesn't add up that they are competent.
Well, that's what's happened here. If it hadn't been for local people employing or getting other people in, they wouldn't have found half the stuff they should have found at the beginning. And so that their credibility, be it Forestry Tas, Forest Practice Authority, the whole thing, the whole government thing, it just doesn't wash. Tasmanian people are very, very sick of it. And it's time for change right now while these reviews are going on.
Well, look, the big thing in politics in Tasmania, I think it's really important that anyone who watches this video understands there's a lot of money behind the scenes that props up this industry. There's a very small minority of people that have invested in this industry and will not let it do what we think is right. The people on the ground will follow the rules. The people halfway up the food chain will follow the rules. But we all know that there are people behind the scenes that have got a lot invested in this, and I don't think they care what happens. And I think it's time the community stop thinking that anyone who says we're not doing the right thing in the bush is a rabid greenie. I think the farmers, I think the average person who goes and watches the footy, which is me, the average person in the street, knows by driving past, they can see that this has not gone the way that it should have gone. Now, clear felling and the way it's happened in Tassie, it's pretty ordinary, and I think people have had enough. Unfortunately, you get the politicians and industry heavyweights using the media to portray anyone who fights against it as being some sort of fringe person. Well, look, it's mainstream now. This is mainstream stuff with mainstream people, with mainstream concerns, because blind Freddy can walk past this bush and go, this needs to be looked after, and blind Freddy can also walk past a coop and say, that's rubbish what they've done there. You've got shit coming into the creek, you've got mud coming into the creek, you've got trees down everywhere, and then napalming it? Come on. You know, it's mainstream now, it's not fringe anymore, and it's about time people woke up and realised that.